Today you can finally find out why I purchased those worms. Hello and welcome back to Bug Realms. On this channel we like to discuss all things creepy crawly, so if that's something that interests you, please consider subscribing to the channel. Now I'm actually stood up today because there is something on my table I need to work with. Don't worry, we will move the camera down when we need to. But the worms is why we are here today. Now there is quite a bit to explain. I don't really want to be talking for ages before we get on to sorting out our little wormery here. So I'm going to try and skip through it the best I can. What we're actually going to be creating is an indoor vermicomposting bin. Yes, that's right. Some of you are probably really confused. Some of you might be saying, what the is vermicomposting? Others are going to be saying, I know what that is. This isn't a gardening channel, Sam. What are we doing here? So please let me explain. First things first. What is vermicomposting? Vermicomposting is basically the breakdown of organic matter, just like normal composting, but with the use of worms. That's it in its basic form. If you want to know more, please Google it and check it out. Otherwise, we stood here for ages. Okay, so why do we want to do vermicomposting? Well, actually, we want to be creating worm castings. So what are worm castings? Come on, Sam, let us know. Worm castings, which I'll show you in a minute because we have some in here, in layman's terms is basically, well, see it as worms poop, right? So where the worms will consume the soil, the organic matter, the nutrients, they then poop it out the other end like every other animal. So why is it so important? Whoa, I nearly fell over then, I'm not drunk. Why is it so important? Well, in the world of isopod keeping, also by some people who keep millipedes, those who keep roaches, those that keep springtails, and those with bioactive setups, all are looking for a special ingredient or two in their substrate to allow either better plant growth, which is not what we're doing it for, or just for that extra nutrient boost. That is what we're doing this for. So, as you know, lately I've got very big into my isopod keeping, and I've got very big into my substrate creation. Now, worm castings, see it like this, okay? So imagine all of the goodness that you would probably feed your isopods anyway, where you would scatter it for them, they would kind of forage for it, eat it up, plus the nutrients in the soil that they also consume. Imagine that being digested by worms, but then it's getting a super boost, it's getting a potency boost. The worms actually have a bacteria in their gut that will kind of, I can't even explain, make it more potent, make it more powerful, make it stronger. So you are getting all of this goodness plus that bacteria in the worm's gut, giving it a super boost to your substrate. That's kind of the easiest way I can explain that. Now, who doesn't want that? As I said, it works for bioactive Vivaria because in gardening it gives a boost to condition your soil to allow your plants to grow better, stronger, healthier, but it also is a great food source for anything that does eat that organic matter. So I'm going to show you an experiment I did probably a few weeks ago now when I first announced worms. I actually tried an experiment with just a few worms in a box with everything that was needed just to test that it was working, and it did work. So now we've got more worms and we are going to a larger scale. So let's take a look at this and let me explain why I've done it this way, why I've chose this type of box, and then we'll move on to creating our bin. So what you ideally need, folks, is a darkened box. Most people who are creating these vermicomposting bins, they use completely dark boxes, but what we're actually going to be doing is covering them so the worms feel safe and secure. Okay, you don't want them stressing out, and too much light on them will cause that stress, so we are just going to be putting a sheet over this. I just find that this box could become useful should anything fail with our vermicomposting bin in the future, and it's just the perfect size. Now the reason I've chosen this height, so we've got it long but we haven't got it tall. You will see a lot of vermicomposting bins being tall. You'll also see some that come in various layers and so on. We don't need that for us. This is an indoor one that stays in the realm. And the reason it's shallow is because the worms that we are going to be using actually only really burrow a few inches deep at a time, and then they leave the rest. So where we would have it tall, the worms that I have chosen to use will never make it down to the bottom, which would just be a little bit pointless. I mean, admittedly, where their frass or worm castings stays on the top, they will then probably move down further, but we don't need that. We just need enough to create a good amount of worm castings from here, which will then be removed, and the soil and bits of goodness will be re-topped up over time. Are you following me here? So when we get a decent amount of worm castings, we take it out, we then refill this, and so on and so forth. Now here is the small tub for the experiment that I also kept in the dark. So this only contains a few worms. Now, can you see how it would look different to normal soil? I don't know if you can pick it up on the camera, but these are all worm castings, so they feel slightly more solid than in your standard soil, but they are just packed full of goodness. Don't know how well you can make it out, but if you look on the side here, you can see the difference. You see the darker patches laying along the top and going through little lines in the substrate. That is all worm castings. That is all goodness made by the few worms that we have in here, and the rest of the soil is yet to be consumed. Pretty cool, right? So you are probably sat there thinking, okay, why have some of these people got really fancy bins? Well, sometimes they have high tiers with a tap on to make compost tea, as it were, so on and so forth. We are not being fancy here, guys. This experiment has worked, therefore in a larger scale it will work for what we need. Now we are going to be making a few changes as well. We are not going to be adding in just any old kitchen scraps, which is what a lot of vermicomposters do. We are going to only be adding in things that have a goodness for our isopods, roaches, millipedes, etc., for our invertebrates in the realm, because this will solely be used for that. If I ever find that I get too much, it will just go into the garden towards the Project Paradise plants. Now I have talked far too much. I've probably started boring you to death, so I'm going to show you now how I am going to set up this bin today. So it's actually going to be very, very straightforward. You can do this at home, and you can do it in smaller scale if you just want to keep one under your kitchen sink, for example, so it's easy to access the correct food scraps for your invertebrates. You can do so. Mine just stays covered over in the corner there. Now I do have to kind of hunch, because if I stand upright you can't see my head, but hey, you can still see the Love Tarantulas t-shirt, so that's pretty cool, right? So we're going to take the lid off. This is so simplistic, guys, and I think anybody keeping isopods should do this at home, even if it's just in small scale. Oh, here. Whew, heavy. I have a bag of Westland's topsoil. This is our #1 brand in the UK when we're using topsoil for invertebrates, because it has no added extras, no nasty chemical fertilizers and so on and so forth. Now, I am choosing topsoil instead of standard compost for various reasons. I don't really want to go into them all because I've done a lot of talking in this video, but I have my reasons, and it's something I am going to be bringing up in the future in one of my isopod videos, why I've chose topsoil over potting soil, compost, cocoa fibre, so on, so forth. So just bear with me and trust me. Now you can use a different substrate. You do not have to copy me with the topsoil if you believe something else is better, but for me this is what I think is the best. So we're just going to tip this in now. So first of all I need to kind of gauge how much I've got here, so I'm just kind of moving it across. You don't want to be compacting this down for worms, you want it a bit more aerated. Now I'm going to leave a little gap at the top here, and the reason being is for where I add food scraps plus the next ingredient. We don't want this overflowing coming too near the top, because worms will go upwards and they could easily escape. I mean, this is a pretty good lid, but I've never tried this exact brand of box before, and if there's ever a slight gap, especially where humidity rises, I don't want a worm seeping out, drying out in my room and dying. So people put various things in for vermicomposting, okay? They put in shredded newspapers and things like that. I don't have any natural papers. I don't want to be using kitchen towel that's bleached white. I don't want to be using newspaper that's got ink. So I will be getting hold of some shredded natural paper, adding in as a worm bedding. They will still eat through that. It still comes from a tree. It has next to no nutrients, but it kind of just works as a food source, as well as places for them to hide and feel comfortable. But for today, we are going to try it out with just mostly leaf litter, which was what I did in here. Now I am using leaf litter from deciduous hardwood trees, and the reason I'm doing that is because that is the best leaf litter for our isopods. And remember, whatever our worms are eating and pooping out, our isopods are then eating. So we are keeping everything suitable for isopods. Now I'm actually going to be crunching up and mixing in this leaf litter because we need some space in the soil. This will help kind of, as I said before, aerate it. It will give them some space, give them some hiding spots, and it will just work really, really well. Now if you want faster consumption of things like the leaves, you can just rip them up, break them down a lot more, but I'm trying to keep this as natural as I can for our worms. These leaves will break down even further over time. The worms will be able to consume them as the breakdown happens. Now you guys at home, feel free to add in some really small bits of rotten white wood into here. It will, as I said, decay over time. This is something that will be going on for years and replenishing over years. So too much is not a problem, guys, because everything that isn't eaten right now will break down. Now I've got my own sort of design of sawdust here. I'll show you how I do that in a future video. Instead of using normal rotten white wood, I am using what is actually rotten white wood sawdust. Don't think this is something you can buy. This is something I created, and I will show you how to do it in a future video. It's fluffy, it's light. Look at that. It just, wow, it feels like holding a cloud. This was one of my most excited creations for my isopods, and now we are adding it in with our worms, and I'm going to mix that through. Now obviously your worms are not going to be able to just digest large bits of wood, but they can kind of work their way into them when they become soft, when the lignum in the wood has dispersed. This is just all the goodness. Now all we're going to be doing is adding in our actual worms, but before we do our spare worms that we've got, we are going to add this whole lot in, including these worm castings here. Now I don't know how well you can see where I've tilted it. This bit here is all our worm castings. This bit here is the soil still remaining. You see the difference. You can see a worm there as well. Now I could have just taken these worm castings out, I admit that, but there wasn't enough there for me to do much with. So come on, wormy wormies, let's get you out of here. Worms, worms. Right, now I'll get you a closer look while we add our extra worms that were purchased for a bin this size. So what I have here between these two is 300 grams of worms. Now if you want to make better scale vermicompost, better larger scale worm castings as it were, I would go for about 1 kilogram of worms, but at the minute I'm still testing this size out, and I thought less is slightly better, because if I find that I'm not feeding them enough, then I know that I can handle more worms, and also they will breed over time. So each bag is 150 grams of worms, and we're just gonna slop it in like so. Look at that. Big pile of wormy worms. Next one, slop it in. You can see where they've created worm castings in their bags that they were sent in as well. Fantastic. We know that they can do their job. Now if you just Google, if you're in the UK at least, probably anywhere actually, just Google composting worms and they'll give you a breakdown of different types of worms and how they work. As I said, I go for ones that tend to stay nearer the surface, though you can get worms that will go deeply as well if you want a taller bin. I've also got a few mixed sizes there, so some have time to grow. Look at them, look, just a pile of worms. There's loads here, absolutely loads. Let's kind of separate some out. Let's put some at different sides of the, oh, slimy, beautiful sliminess. Sorry guys, we need you to start taking over everywhere. It's great, this stuff is great. Not the worms, the worm castings. I can just see them all everywhere. I don't know how well you can make them out on the video compared to normal dirt. You can feel it in the texture. Can you see how that's not like your standard soil there? This is all perfect stuff, and I could just chuck this in with isopods now if I wanted to, but I want to wait. I want to wait until these guys have consumed a lot more of this. Now they will be burrowing down probably very quickly. You can see some of them doing it now, but obviously I've just disturbed them because they don't like the light, which is why this will be covered. Okay then, so we've already said how I will keep this covered, so you want them dark. Okay, I've already suggested that you buy worms suitable for your bin, so if mine are shallow feeders, you want a shallower bin. If yours are deep feeders, you want a deep bin. Okay, I've already shown you some of the basics that I've put in, like the leaf litter, like some of my awesome blend here that we'll discuss in the future. Great, what else then? Well, what you don't want to do will be easier to explain. You want to steer clear from the onion family. Onions, celeries, things like that. Anything from the onion family you want to stay away from because it's a bit too much for the animals to handle. It's not particularly great for the worms, although they will eat it. And it also is not going to be good for millipedes, isopods, so on and so forth. Now I actually have a little calendar or diary type thing I keep downstairs where I keep my food scraps. And that diary shows week by week what I plan on feeding these guys. So week 1 I call green week, and that is where I feed them greens basically. So leftover things like cabbage leaves, spinach, things like that, full of great goodness. Through the week of week 2 is what I call brown week, and that is where I will feed them, well, things that aren't really that brown. I just call it brown week, okay? So like sweet potato, carrots, things like that. So things that are shades of reds, oranges, browns, that kind of thing. And then I go to week 3 is what I call white week, and in white week I add fungus mostly, so button mushrooms, things like that. Chop them all up, put them in here. I also have picked up a tendency to peel mushrooms now. Some people do that naturally. I find it a bit weird, but I've started doing it now, so I can put those peelings in here as well. Also some of the stalks that I don't eat. If the stalks are too large, I tend to rip them off of mushrooms, so I chop them up, put them in. But it will also be my calcium source week, so I'll have some ground eggshells and things to put in with them as well. And then the final week is basically just a mixture of everything. And this is not set in stone. This is something I've come up with. It all has to go under testing. If I find that they're not eating certain foods, we'll move on to something else. But you also really need to keep an eye on your vermicomposting bin, because you need to make sure that you're not leaving too many scraps just lying there if it's an indoor one, because you're going to get a lot of like flies and bits and bobs coming around in your house. So for an outdoor one, you can literally just lob the scraps in and leave it. For indoors, just try and make sure you're not overfeeding if you can, unless you really don't mind a bit of mold and a few flies flying around. And the way to do that is to gauge it by your weight of worms. So with my 300 grams of worms, I will try to not be feeding more than 300 grams of food scraps at a time. They can eat up to 100% of their body weight, mostly up to around 80% of their body weight. So we can then take off 20% of that 300 grams and give them that amount of food. And it's just trial and error, okay? This is new to me too, okay? But as I said, my little experiment worked. Did you see any moldy food scraps in there? No, you didn't. Did you see worm castings? Yes, you did. So it does work. Were those worms alive when I poured them in? Yes, they were. So this clearly works. It may not be fancy, it may not be what you'll see on big gardening channels and so on and so forth, but it works, and I've proven that to you by showing you the experimental tub. And now we're going to continue our experiment to work out everything else. If I find something cool or I find something new, I will let you guys know, but I think this is going to be it for today's video. Remember, if you keep isopods, maybe not just one or two, but if you really are into them like me, or you are a millipede keeper, or you like lots of bioactive setups, rather than buying worm castings, create it at home. See, I've also worked a lot out in timing, or the best that I can. See, I have a massive bag of worm castings downstairs pre-bought. The idea is by the time that massive bag is used up in my enclosures, this should then provide enough worm castings for when I have to do substrate changes. And then by the time it comes to substrate change, again, this should repopulate the worm castings. So it should be a continuous cycle where I've only ever had to buy one actual bag, and it's going to save me a fortune in the world of these wonderful inverts that require a decent substrate. One more thing before I go: watering. You want this to stay moist but not wet. A lot of people say the same thing, but it's the best way of explaining it. When you squeeze it, you don't want water to be coming out of a bowl, you just want it to feel damp. And I will only be using spring water or rainwater in here. So I have pots that collect rainwater outside, and I also have bottles of spring water, and that's because your tap water contains chlorine, not so good for these animals. So yes, keep it damp, keep it dark, keep them fed, you get your worm castings. I'm off. See you later guys, take care, bye bye.